And so here was what we covered last night. We looked at Ephesians 5 on the subject, or on the first thought of, here's God's simple plan. Husbands, all you got to do is lovingly lead. And the two words go together. God says you're to be the head, but you're to do it in love. Remember, there were several reasons why. God doesn't want you to be a dictator, so He says you lovingly lead. And He also tells you to love because that tempers your wife's responsibility. She has to follow you. And if you're a loving leader, then you make her side of the equation a much easier thing to do. And that's God's plan. And then we talked about wives respectfully partnering with their husband. The Bible word is submission. It's a military term. And remember, I tried to illustrate last night. I'm not sure if I communicated exactly what was in my heart, but I was trying to illustrate for you that in the military, you submit even if the general's a jerk. But when you have a leader in the military who is a man of character and integrity and love and grace, and he's a gentleman and so forth, it's amazing how many soldiers will give their life for that general. They partner with him on a different level. Now, you can partner with a husband that's not a great husband. And you know what? God will honor you for doing that because that's your responsibility. But the fact of the matter is, if you as a husband are doing everything you're supposed to do and lovingly leading your wife, and your wife then is able to respectfully partner with you, when the two are working hand in hand, glove to glove there, I'm telling you, you've got a beautiful picture, which is why he says in Ephesians 5 that the marriage is a picture of what? You know it? Of Christ in the church. Because it's a perfect example of how you and I are to love our God, our Savior, and serve Him and give Him our all and partner with Him to do the work that He's called us to do. And He loves us unconditionally. By the way, guys, sometimes guys will come to a counseling session and they'll say, you know what, I just don't feel like we're in love anymore. And I always say to the guy, are you a Christian? And I got to tell you something, you don't have an option. Because if a guy says, hey, Lord, I know I want to love my wife. Tell me how much. Tell me how much I got to love my wife. The Lord says, all right, let me give you an illustration. I want you to love her as much as Christ loved the church. And that's like, wow. You know what that would tell us? There is never a reason for a man not to love his wife. Ever. Doesn't mean in our sin-cursed world that it's always easy. Doesn't mean that at all. But the illustration the Lord gave says a man should never stop loving his wife. And by the way, if you're in the building tonight by chance and you're thinking, well, you know, that sounds great for you to say, but we're no longer in love. I can tell you why. If you are no longer in love, here's why. The reason is because you stopped doing what you did that said to your spouse that you loved them. Because love is doing. You know that, don't you? Love's not a feeling. Y'all did know that, didn't you? Now, feelings are great. Don't you like feelings? I know we're Baptists, but it's okay to feel, isn't it? We like feelings. Feelings are part of life. And you remember when you got married because you had all the doing and the saying, and it was all together. And boy, it was thrilling. It was so exciting. And the wedding day came, and it was, you know, trumpets and music and excitement and I do's. And oh my goodness, it was amazing. But you know what happens? You get married, and sometimes couples fall into the routine of just going through life, and we stop doing all the things we did that made our spouse realize how much we love them. And there comes a point, and we say it like this, in our culture, we just fell out of love. Well, actually, you didn't fall anywhere. You just stopped. Just a little here and a little there, you stopped. So here's a good reminder. You and I got to be working on our marriages. If you're going to be the church you ought to be, this church ought to be known as having incredible, amazing, wonderful marriages. And you know, it's okay to have happy marriages. You know that, don't you? Our culture ridicules it. Did you know that? Our culture ridicules it, laughs at it. If you watch a Hollywood sitcom and here's a couple, they're dating, they're so romantic and they're so amazing and they're so, wow, it's so exciting. Or they're living together. Oh my goodness, things are just great. And then there's a married couple. And Hollywood always depicts them as, oh my word, fight like cats and dogs. I mean, that's not even something new. Remember the program I Love Lucy? Think Fred and, what was her name? Ethel. Think Fred and Ethel. Now, I laugh at I Love Lucy.
But I wouldn't want to be like Fred and Ethel. Not on your life. Someone, what was it? We were watching it one night, and I think it was Ricky. Is that Ricky? Ricky's the other guy. Ricky says to Fred, he says, Fred, do you know anything about rice? And Fred goes, just that it was thrown at me on the darkest day of my life. I was like, that's kind of funny. That's really sad. A marriage, the day you got married shouldn't be thought of as the darkest day of your life. You got to keep your marriage happy. It's important. You know, even in the church, sometimes we miss it. Because here's what you see in the church. A young couple gets married in the church, and you know there's this thing. I don't know if they even still use this term or not, so you young people, forgive me if you don't know this. But when I was a kid, they called it puppy love. Y'all know that term? Is that okay? And that was, here's this couple, they're newly married. And in the church, we'll say things like this. They'll get over it. Isn't that how we think? Here's a couple, and they're like, oh my goodness. They sit in church, and they're like, all hugged up in one body with two heads because they're newlyweds. And we all tend to kind of chuckle and say, oh, you're no newlywed. But the fact of the matter is, why does that have to stop after you've been married for a while? Now, I don't think you need to embarrass the preacher while you're sitting in the auditorium, okay? But you ought to be madly in love, and everybody ought to know it. This is a church. And Almighty God designed marriage. So husbands lovingly lead and wives respectfully partner. And remember this one. This one was a good one, wasn't it? Couples happily unite. You are called of God not to be two, but one flesh. And we parked there for a while. And then really, where I stopped last night was in chapter 6, verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's where we'll read tonight. So go to chapter 6, and tonight we're going to pick up in verse 1. Children. All right, boys and girls, are you awake? Young men, he's talking to you now. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. That's our children's first memory verse when they're born. As soon as they're born, they get ready for bed at night. We started devotions as soon as we could, just a tiny little baby. And I'd, tuck them into bed, and they just, they've got a full tummy, and now it's time. And I'd reach down and get their little hands, like 1 or 2 or 3 days old, and I'd start their memory verse. I'd hold their little hands, even if they were crying. I'd hold their hands and say, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And we said it every night until they could say it themselves. And I think it was Abby came in one night, and she said, children, and she didn't say it in, good English, because baby talk. She said, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for they are right. That's not what it says. It says, for this is the right thing to do. Moms and dads aren't always right, but children are to obey. And then the Bible says, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Don't you want God's favor and blessings in your life? Here's a way to have it. Have a right spirit towards your mom, towards your dad. Be obedient, be honoring, show them respect. And he says then in verse 4, and ye fathers. Now, he says fathers, and I think I said this last night because he's just reminding us a few verses earlier that husbands are to be the head of the wife, which is a Bible way of saying the head of a home. So he really nails you fathers. Now, ladies, you're not exempt because we learned a moment ago that submission is partnering with your husband. And what greater responsibility do we have as a couple, besides having a happy marriage, than training and raising our children for Jesus Christ? So he does say fathers in the context. He's the head. But wives, you're to submit and partner. He says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, 2 things we want to park on tonight. Children, obey and honor. I'm not going to park here very long because really, moms and dads, if you do what you're supposed to do, you will help your children with this. But you teenagers might need a reminder tonight. You may say, well, I'm 13 years old and I got 2 hairs on my chest. I'm becoming a man. Yeah, but you're still under the authority of your parents, and so you ought to be a yes mom, a yes dad, maybe even work on the yes sir, yes ma'am. Do whatever shows respect in your family. Not everybody does that, but the fact of the matter is, you ought to be very obedient, very respectful. And you boys and girls know, don't you? And moms and dads, you ought to know this too, that obedience means I do it first and fast and with a happy face and a happy heart. All of our lives, there are going to be rules we don't like. It's not about it always being easy. How many of you have a car? Raise your hand good high if you have a car. Are there any rules that you don't like? Like the rule says drive 35. How many of you hate that rule that says drive 35? How many of you, well, don't answer that. Now, here's the deal. You know what you got to learn as a young person is you got to learn to obey and honor your mom and dad because that helps you the rest of your life. I promise you, kids, somewhere along the way, you're going to have a boss in your life who's going to say da-da-da-da-da, and you're going to have to obey and honor or lose a job. It's just that simple. You're going to have a police officer who's going to say, this is what you got to do, and you have to obey and honor, or your life's going to get really turned upside down. And so obedience and honor are very, very important. And by the way, God wants you to know it comes with a promise. He promises to bless you if you'll do it. He promises His favor in your life if you'll do it. And so children, obey and honor your parents. That's in these verses. And I'll tie it in together with this next one. Parents, you and I as moms and dads are to successfully train. Now let me poll the crowd tonight so I know who I'm talking to. How many of you in the building are moms and dads? Raise your hand good night. All right. How many of you are raising children? Let me see your hand. If you're raising children, that would be mine. I'm done with a few, but I'm raising others. How many of you are grandparents and you're done raising your children? Let me see your hand. That should be all of you if you're a grandparent. But how many of you have grandchildren that you still want to influence? Can I see your hand? All right. So there's great needs here tonight. Parents are to successfully train their children. Now, there are 4 thoughts in verse 4, and they're real simple. Here's what he says. Number 1, don't anger your children. Then he says, train them and teach them and do it so that they will serve God. Now let's think about that just for a moment. Simple little verse, verse 4. Don't anger your children. Did you know that it is apparently an easy thing for a mom and dad to sidetrack their children's training by angering them? Apparently that's an easy thing. It's a major part of the command of God if I'm going to have a happy home. Don't anger your children, Dad. So how do you even do that? Well, I suppose all of us could think it through, couldn't we? I know it's angering and troubling and harassing to our children when we have unreasonable expectations or when we're inconsistent. We all battle that. But if the word that describes your life and parenting is inconsistency, you will anger your children. If one moment you're like the dictator that's going to rain fire and brimstone on your head, and the next moment they can get by with murder, then I promise you're harassing your children. You're angering them. You'll frustrate them. Sometimes we do it by not parenting. How many of you are aware of the fact that it's a whole lot easier to harass your children than it is to parent them? Are you aware of that? It's a whole lot easier. Harassment sounds like this. How many times have I told you, for crying out loud? That you're not parenting now, you're just harassing. You're frustrated. I'm telling you, I've had it up to here with you. I brought you in this world. I will take you out. All we're doing is harassing. That's not parenting. If I'm always raising my voice and flying off the handle and I'm gruff and harsh and irritated, all I'm doing is harassing. That's not parenting. And sometimes we do it by asking dumb questions. You know, always get a kick out of a dad who, here's a girl, it's his daughter, and she's not dressed in the way he thinks she ought to dress, so he harasses her. Sweetheart, why in the world would you want to wear that? Come on, sweetheart, why would you want to dress like that? Don't you know? And you're harassing. Dads aren't called to harass. They're called to train. If your daughter's wearing something she shouldn't wear, this isn't a time to harass her and belittle her. This is a time for you to say, hey, sweetheart, you and I need to talk. So I got to tell you, apparently I haven't communicated properly what we expect in our family about dress. And I want to tell you why the way we dress is important. You know, there's different applications of this. I understand it. The way you might think is okay to dress, maybe a little different than somebody else, but all of us have to deal with these kind of issues in a family, don't we? And so I've got to take time to teach and say, I remember one of the hardest things, because children, I've got 5, and children want to look nice, they want to fit in, they want to be cool. And so I remember telling my daughter one day, I said, you know, Abby, I know this is so hard, because sometimes our standard means it's not the coolest thing everybody else is wearing, but I tell you what I will do, to the best of my ability, your mom and I will do all that we can to help you find the nicest clothes possible to fit the standard that we have, so that you always feel beautiful and you always look nice and you always, feel confident. What are we trying to do? We're parenting, not harassing. Even in the dating scene, I always get a kick out of this one. Sometimes a dad will be like, come on, sweetheart, why do you want to date that jerk? There's not an answer to that question. There's no answer. It's like a dad says, come on, sweetheart, why do you want to date that jerk? And the girl goes, oh, come on, Dad. I know he wears that T-shirt that says, kill your parents. But Dad, if you just get to know him, he's a really sweet guy. It's not like a dad's going to go, oh, what was I thinking? Had I known he was sweet, I would have let you marry him the first day you met him. See, there's no answer to that. It's easier to harass your children than to train them. And I am convinced that our culture is so busy and we are so focused on so many things. Sometimes we're so uptight about our standards and our positions that we end up harassing our children rather than training them. You are called of God not to harass your children, but to encourage them, to train them, to teach them, to be a blessing, which is why he tells us in the passage, bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Bring them up is a word that has the idea of nourish. To nourish, in Bible terminology, is to provide optimal conditions for growth. It's a gardening type term. So if I'm going to plant a garden, I've got to do a lot of work so that there are proper conditions for the growth of my garden. I've got to have the right soil. I've got to invest time in getting the weeds out. I've got to take the time to get sunlight. I've got to make sure there's enough moisture. I've got to choose the right seeds. I've got to protect it from the attack of birds and rabbits and deer. There's a ton of work that goes into nourishing a garden. And the same thing's true with your children. Man, it takes a ton of work to nourish. That's training. And you got to teach them. What are you teaching your children? What are you teaching them? We had a tire blow on my van several years ago, and I was driving it by myself. We have a 15-passenger van at that time, so that we could all go on the road and take all of our luggage and still have some room. And we drove that van 385,000 miles. And just sold it a few months ago, actually. One day I'm driving that van by myself, and I hit something on the road, and my tire went flat instantly. Boom! And I was on the side of the road by myself, and it was raining. And I changed the tire. Nobody else there to help me. I pulled out. I had bought one of those, plus sign wrenches. You ever seen those? And I got my plus sign wrench out, and I broke, and I jacked it up, and I spun the lug nuts off and pulled the tire off. Now my hands are dirty, and I threw it in the back. Now my pants are dirty. And I put the spare on and spun it all back and lowered it, and I took it down to a tire shop to get it repaired. The guy repaired it, and then he said, hey, pull your van around here, and I'll put that one on for you. And I said, that's not necessary. He said, you don't want me to put the tire on? I said, no. He said, why? I said, I have sons. Now, it's a silly thing, but the truth is, I realize as I'm changing a tire on the side of the road, my boys don't know how to do this. It's not like, every day you blow a tire. And I thought they need to know. So I brought it home. I said to the boys, come on here. We're going to have some training today. You know what? Your daughter won't know how to. We harass this generation something terrible. This generation doesn't even know how to drive a stick shift. Well, you know what? That's our fault. It's not like I learned how to drive a stick shift by accident. I had a dad that put me in a car and said, all right, son, there's the clutch. Push her down. Put your foot on the brake. Put it in first gear. Right there's first, except in those days I was doing it up here. Put it in first gear, pop that clutch, give it fuel, let's go. He taught my brother to do that. And we live way out in the country, and where my mom and dad lived, if you come from Wartburg, the back way, you go down a ravine, across a river, and then you go up, and just about a half a mile from my mom and dad's house, there is an absolute uphill switchback. And there's no guardrail. It's in the middle of nowhere in the country. And if you look over the side, it's about 70 feet drop to the bottom of the little ravine there. My dad had an old Jeep pickup truck with a 5-speed transmission on the floor. He's training my brother to drive a stick shift. My brother gets on that curve, and he gets halfway through the curve, and he stalls the Jeep. My dad's the calmest guy in the world. He said, well, son, put her in first gear and let's pull out. So my brother, he's all nervous. He's on a hill, and there's a 70-foot drop behind him. And he puts the clutch in, he puts it in first gear, pops the clutch, and stalls the engine and rolls back a foot. He did it a second time, stalled the engine, rolled back a foot. He did it a third time, stalled the engine, rolls back. He does it 4 times. My brother told me this. I wasn't there. My brother said that our dad, he opened the door and he looked back. My dad turned around, shut the door, and said, "It's your last chance, son." And my brother said, I had no idea that Jeep could burn rubber in 3 gears. But I'll tell you, we didn't go over the hill, but we burned rubber in that old Jeep. Now, see, my brother wouldn't know how to drive a stick shift. See, it's easy to harass. Oh, my word, this generation can't do nothing, we say. Well, I don't mean to be mean, but the reason this generation can't do anything is we haven't trained them. Training is the necessity in parenting. And here's why: I'm not to anger my children. I'm to train them. I'm to teach them. And I'm to do it so they will serve God. And that's the point of Ephesians 6 and verse 4. Because he says, "Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the what? Of the Lord." We're doing more than training our sons to make money. We're doing more than training our daughters to change diapers. We are to raise our children so that in the years to come, they will serve God because of our training and because of our teaching. Did you know, ladies and gentlemen, really that the key word in parenting is the word train? Did you know that? It's the key word. Which is why the enemy has us so busy in the home, we never train anymore. My grandfather trained me in all kinds of things. Grandparents here tonight, listen, you got grandsons and granddaughters, and you can get frustrated and roll your eyes because they play video games all the time, or you could have them over and teach them how to garden. Some of you older ladies, you are good cooks. And your granddaughter, her husband's going to starve to death unless you get involved. You can't live on McDonald's all the time. A home-cooked meal is good occasionally, isn't it? But they won't know if you don't train them. The key word is train. How many of you know this passage? Do you know this verse right here? Here's a great verse for moms and dads, and we all ought to know it. The Bible, in fact, let's look at it. Look at it. Turn over to Proverbs. You can find Proverbs, can't you? You're in Psalms, and some of you have an app, so you can cheat and find it fast. Proverbs 22 and verse 6 is a verse you ought to know, and don't be afraid of it. For some reason, Christianity doesn't like this verse, and they explain it away and simplify it down and discuss it and hash it and rehash it. But it is the Bible, so whatever it says is true, okay? Whatever it says is true. And here's what it says: "Train up a child in the way he should go. And when he's old, he'll not depart from it." You get the idea that training is important, don't you? Because what the Bible is saying here, among other things, is that my child's future will be dependent on my training. Moms and dads, you're that important. You and I have got to be absolute experts at training. Look at that verse and take it apart just for a moment. We won't be long tonight, but take it apart. The first thing it says is train. Now, you know what that means, don't you? To train in the Hebrew is to dedicate. One of the words is to fence. As a farm kid, that makes sense to me. When we're taking cattle to the market, we'd put them in the corral. There's a loading chute off the edge of the corral, and you back the cattle truck up to the corral, open the gates, and you drive a cow, a heifer, or a steer into that chute. They're fences. They're always a little nervous about that truck. They don't know what's in there, and they don't want to go in there. And plus, they're going uphill. It's an awkward time for the steer or the cow, and yet they can't go anywhere because of training. They're fenced. So the steer tries to go this way because he doesn't want to go in the truck. He can't because there's a fence there. Tries to go this way. Can't. There's a fence there. The word train is to dedicate our children. It's to fence them. One thing moms and dads ought to be really good at are having good and godly and gentle and easy to understand fences in your children's life. It's why Jacob, who has an old smartphone, can only use it for calling and texting and messaging. He doesn't have access to the internet. Why? Because I put a fence in his life. Why? Because there's 3 million pornographic sites that he could access if I open it up for him to get on the internet. I'm 49 years old. I have fences on my own life about that. I have a smartphone. I have the internet on it, but everything we do on the internet goes through Covenant Eyes, and my wife and staff and one of my close friends get a copy of that every 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days. What is it? It's a fence in my life. It's to make sure that with 3 million sites of garbage on this phone access, I got a fence there. Maybe in a moment of weakness, there's a temptation to look at. I can't because I got Covenant Eyes and it blocks it. I want those fences in my children's life. Your children won't always know how to handle a lousy friend that's enticing them to do wrong. But if you put fences in their life, there's some blocks. The word means to dedicate, to fence. It means to aim. This is Michigan. Michigan loves to hunt. Any hunters in the room? Any bow hunters in the room? Michiganders love to hunt. My father-in-law was from Michigan, and he loved to hunt. He just, hunting was important to him. And he'd take me hunting every year. I miss him. He was my hunting partner. And I never did the bow hunting thing, but I know a little bit about bow hunting. If I were to take an arrow, the word train means to aim, and I were to put an arrow in my bow, and I were to aim at the X on that exit sign at the back door. So here I am aiming, that's training. I pull the bow back, I aim, I release that bow. You know what arrows tend to do? They tend to go in the direction they're pointed. That's kind of silly, isn't it? But there's a lesson there. Here's what Psalm 127 verse 3 says. As arrows are in the hands of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. When children are young, they're like an arrow in the hand of a mighty man. They tend to go in the way they're aimed. So that if you go to Walmart, you go to Meijer, I was told last night, singular. If you go to Meijer, and you're in Meijer, and here's a child, and they're pitching a fit. Oh, they're yelling, they're screaming, they're stomping, they're mad, and everybody knows it, and they're hitting their mom, and they're out of control. You know what they're doing? Just going in the way they're aimed. Because all children are being trained. All of them. Your job and my job is to train them so that when we release them from our care, they literally are being pushed with great power in the direction they ought to go. Does that make sense or not? Are y'all following me on this? So training is important. It's why it's so important that God gives us 18 years to do it. Here's my Charity, and Charity's got some things she's yet got to learn, but I'm not overly troubled about it because she's 10. So I have about 8 more years. You can do a lot in 8 years. Did you know that? You can lose a lot of weight in 8 years if you'll get serious about exercise. That was a little personal, wasn't it? Didn't have to quite go there. You could learn, you could make a lot of investments in 8 years if you started putting a lot of money into the right stocks. You can make a lot of money in 8 years. 8 years can make a big difference. Here's Jacob now, he's 15. So, Jacob know everything I want him to know? Well, not yet. He's on the right track. He's a good kid. But I got 3 more years with him. And even that's kind of cutting down because he'll be 16 this summer. In fact, in less than a month. I have 2 years. You following me? How old are your kids? Think about how little time you have. And yet, be encouraged because you still have some time. To train is to dedicate, to aim, defense. Are y'all following me tonight? And then notice what he says, because this is important. Train, he says, a child. Now, I don't want to go farther than the Bible goes. But the Bible doesn't say train children. It says train up a child in the way he, singular, should go. How many of you have more than one child? Let me see your hand. You have more than one child? All right, now think, if you have more than one child, he's not telling you to throw them all together and train them. You're to train each child apparently individually. If you have more than one child, you know this, don't you? They're all different. Is that right or not? Like my son Josh. Josh is not Matthew, and Josh and Matthew are not Jacob. They're totally different. Now, there are similarities. They're youngs, so they're handsome. Probably a little stubborn. You know who they get that from. Their mom, of course. Or their dad. But they're all different. Abby and Josh were our first two. They were 14 months apart. And it was amazing how different they were. Abby is industrious. That's the word to describe her. That girl could get the job done. She can clean the house, cook the meal, do the dishes, and get everybody involved. Everybody's working, man, she gets it done. She can get it done. She's driven. But she was dishonest. Oh, my soul, she was dishonest. She would lie to you. She would just flat out lie to you. Josh, 14 months younger, total opposite. She's industrious, he's lazy. Josh, we're always, come on, son, get up, make your bed, pick up your laundry. We're on him all the time. You got to finish the job. And Josh, he has one speed, slow. He's lazy. He was lazy, but he was impeccably honest. In fact, it was like Josh can't lie. He's just flat out honest. If you wanted to know who did it, ask Josh. Because it's just like, he just says, he just answers it. It's the weirdest thing. And sometimes his honesty could get awkward. We were in a church years ago in Pennsylvania when our kids were younger. And this is the absolute truth. I hate to even say this, but it's the truth. It was the weirdest church we'd ever been to. The building was awkward. The parking lot was designed. I was like, how did you get a church? Who built this place? And I like things being symmetrical. You know what I mean by that? Like I like things ordered and parallel and centered. This church had a railing. It was a round railing at the front, and the pulpit was nailed into the railing, but it wasn't centered. It was nailed into the railing right here. And it just drove me nuts. I mean, I'd walk in and there's that, and I wanted to move it to the middle, but you can't. It's nailed. If I'd have owned that church, I'd have burned it down and started over. It was, and I don't mean this to be mean. It just was. This just caught us so off guard because the church was just weird. The way they did Sunday school, we were like, "Are you kidding? I don't know why they're doing this." And the morning service, we were like, we spent the whole morning with our mouth open. We were just stunned. So after the service, the pastor takes our entire family out to eat, and we sit at this huge round table at this really rather high-class restaurant. And the pastor, he's real talkative, and he says to my children, "Hey, young kids," he said, "what's the weirdest church you've ever been to?" My son Josh cannot lie. So he's like, eating an hors d'oeuvre or whatever he had there. And Josh goes, "Yours." And I was mortified. I was like, for crying out loud. I'd have kicked him under the table, but he would have probably said, "Father, why art thou kicking me under the table?" Because it just, what is in there comes out. The pastor even made it worse because the pastor laughed. Like, "Isn't that kid funny?" And then the pastor goes, "No, really, what's the weirdest church you've ever been to?" And is it wrong to say, God help him to lie at least once in his life? And he didn't let him down. Josh is like, "No, yours." And now I'm the one lying. Boy, that kid's a comedian, isn't he? Now here's the whole point. Abby's not Josh. You know why? I've wondered. Have you ever wondered this? How come in some families, you'll have a family where, they got a big family and all the kids but one turn out great? I've often wondered, do you suppose it could be because sometimes in our parenting, we have one child that struggles in an area that we feel very strongly about, so we're all over that child to correct their weakness. And we got another child, and yes, they have weaknesses because all kids do, but their weakness isn't that big of a deal to us. Because maybe it's like our weakness. Maybe we have the same weakness, and we did okay, so we overlook their weakness. We're really hard on this one over here, but not so hard on this one because their weakness isn't that big a deal. The Bible tells us something, moms and dads here, that's incredibly important. I have to train every child. My oldest, there's two things I always try to remember. As a daddy, God has called me to strengthen their strengths, because strengths are God-given. and to correct their weaknesses so that their weaknesses don't undermine their strengths. And every child has a different strength and a different weakness. I even, when my kids were younger, I had a journal for a while. And I would take every week to sit down for a moment or two to think through, how are my kids doing in this area, in this area? What are their weaknesses? What are their strengths? What do we need to emphasize? How do we need to work on it? What can we improve? We're not being mean, we're training. You do know that your children have weaknesses, don't you? You better know what the weakness is, and don't downplay their strengths. Strengths are God-given. If your child has an area of talent, celebrate it. God gives your children talents. Maybe your child is brilliant. Well, then don't belittle, oh my word, I don't want my kid to get the big head. You're not nearly as smart as you think you are. No, if your kid's smart, encourage them in that. Some of us need brains, don't we? I mean, aren't you thankful there's a John Ben Geldern in the world who writes books that you have to think over every page? You're like, wow. Yeah, I love to hear Brother John preach because he can preach one sermon and I can take it and preach 10. Because there's no way I can preach one sermon what he just said. It takes me like 3 days. It's just, we're all different. Maybe your son's an outdoorsman. Boy, he likes to be outdoors and he likes to work. Well, you know what? We need some good farmers in Michigan. Maybe you need to strengthen him. Maybe God's going to use him as a dairy farmer. You see, we all have different, but all your kids have weaknesses. You got a kid that's dishonest, you better pick it up. Go to work on that. You got a kid that's lazy on the lazy side, you better pick it up. And I want to tell you, what's encouraging is when you know their weakness and you work on it, and then you see God help them to overcome the weakness. My son, Josh, it's the truth, isn't it, sweetheart? He was lazy. There's just no doubt about it. He was. But when Josh went off to Bible college, he's at West Coast Baptist College in California. One of the delights of our heart as mom and dad is when after his freshman year, he became a supervisor. So he works in what they call Blue Crew. The ministry is very large, and they have several different churches, a Spanish church, a Korean church, and an English service, and they have Sunday schools and an academy as well as a college. And so they're always setting up and tearing down different rooms for different ministries, and a wedding this weekend, and a birthday party this weekend, and a conference that weekend. And my son was the guy they put over all of that. And he was responsible. And I was thrilled about that because you know what? There were times I thought, Lord, is he ever going to get it? Is he ever going to pick it up and be a man and work hard? But he did. Now, it took us about 18 years. That's why God gives you 18 years. Train a child. And watch this. The Bible says, in the way he should go, which doesn't that imply there's a right way? And I love the Hebrew picture in this verse because in the way he should go is a Hebrew idiom that, can I say this gently, is really kind of hard to translate if you did it literally. Because it literally in the Hebrew has the idea, train him in the way of his mouth. It's like, well, train him in the way of his mouth? But if you do some studying, here's what you find out. The Bible here is saying that we're to train our children's appetites. Now chew on that just a moment. Because every one of our kids will grow up. Some of our kids in this generation grow up and they have an appetite for hours and hours and hours of video games. They have an appetite for sports. That's their life. Where'd they get that appetite? They never go to church on Sunday. They're running to play ball. Church isn't important. Who needs to go to church? I go sometimes. We got a ball game Sunday afternoon, so we got to miss Sunday morning so we can get to the game, and we don't make it Sunday night because we're coming home from the game. Ball games is where it's at. They got an appetite for sports because moms and dads gave them the appetite. That's why moms and dads are going to be careful about the television, because we can give our children an appetite for materialism. If we don't guard these things, inadvertently, we didn't intend it to happen, but through these things we can give our children a lifelong appetite for pornographic material. I'm to train their appetites. Do your children have an appetite for the things of God? Do they have an appetite for church? Is church something you do? All right, we got to go to church. Or is church something you do because you're training an appetite? You know what? When we go home, I got to tell you what we do sometimes. When we go home, we always have this little quandary. We go to church every night. We go to church Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, and sometimes Saturday night. And we can do that for this is our third week in a row, and we got one more week, and then we got a down week. And sometimes when we're home in a down week, Sunday afternoon, we always come home to eat. My wife always, that's her gift to me. I eat out so much on the road that when I'm home, I ask Bethany to cook a home-cooked meal. So she gets up early on Sunday morning, and when I get out of bed on Sunday morning, often the aroma is already started. It's a beautiful thing. And we come home, and then it's, Sunday afternoon, you got a full stomach. And we went to church every night for the last 4 weeks. And here's what we always have a quandary with. Do you suppose that all adds up and we could skip to church tonight? It's not like the Bible says, thou shalt go to church on Sunday night. So maybe we could skip it. But if the kids were up here talking to you, they'd tell you what we always do. We always say, oh no, it's our church. That's our church. That's our family. We go to church to sing and worship. Sunday night's family night. You know what we do on family night? We go to church. We sing, talk, and laugh. Then we go home and watch a film. We watch films because we're spiritual. Some people watch movies because they're not, but we're spiritual. We watch films. And we'll watch a film, eat pizza, laugh, talk, cut up, be silly. It's family night. But we want our kids to have an appetite for church and the things of God. Train up a child in the way he should go. There's a right way. And here's the point of this passage. Catch the last one. So they will go that way is the point of the text. I'm to go overboard in training because training affects their future. Can I ask you a question? Does it work? Does training matter when they're an adult? Can you think of an illustration? I had a guy say to me one time, I'll tell you right now, he said, bless God, I wouldn't drive a Ford. I said, where'd you get that? I know where he got it. From his daddy. His dad said Ford stands for Fix or Repair Daily. Found on road dead. I wouldn't drive a Ford. I said to him, buy me a Chevy, I'll drive it. And he wasn't quite that gung-ho about it. But why would a guy think that way? Because he was trained. I think I heard a preacher the other night mention Brussels sprouts. Y'all remember that? How many of y'all like Brussels sprouts? Let me see your hand. How many of you do not like Brussels sprouts? Let me see your hand. Okay, now why would a person like Brussels sprouts? Because they were trained. You know what balut is? Balut is a Filipino dish. Balut is an egg, a duck egg with the baby inside it. Take it, boil it, peel it, drink the juice, and chew up the baby. They do it. Don't they, Jake? They did it at breakfast a few weeks ago. You know what they had the audacity to say to us? You should try it. You know what I say when they tell me you should try it? You know what I say? Let me pray about it. The Lord said no. I tell God, you don't want me to disobey God? I can't eat that. God said no. Now you tell me, ladies and gentlemen, why in the world would people in the Philippines eat a duck with a baby inside it? There's only one word that I know of. They were trained. That's it. They were trained. In fact, I said, pastor's daughter was a beautiful young lady. She's just finished nursing school, and she's dressed beautifully, and we go out to eat. And so she was sitting by me, and I said, do you eat balut? You know, you would think a girl with a nursing degree would be smart enough to know the right answer. Do you eat balut? She said, oh yeah, love it. Why? And pastor said, well, really, he said, the reason my kids love balut is he said, when we first started the ministry, I was an evangelist. And we didn't have a car, so we rode the bus all over the Philippines. And we didn't have any money. But balut is very cheap. So every time it was time to eat, we'd all stop and I'd buy all the kids a balut. And our kids, that was sometimes their breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were trained. It's that simple, church. You grandparents in this room tonight, you got grandchildren, they need training. And maybe your kids aren't doing it. Well, you need to stop bringing them over and sit them in front of a DVD. Daddy, if your Grandpa, if your grandson can't change a tire, maybe you need to have a little grandpa-grandson time. Train him how to change a tire. You know, I don't know, there's just something about a boy. He loves to drive a tractor. Buy a tractor and train him how to drive it. Boys just love to shift gears, pop clutches, and burn rubber. Tires are replaceable, let him. Show him how to do it right. It doesn't hurt to smoke a few tires and let a boy be a boy. Don't get arrested. That wouldn't help your church. But we got to train our kids. Am I making sense tonight? I need to train. Let me just throw 4 things at you. It's 8:05. I got them on the screen. I'll throw them fast, and I'm done. Train obedience. You got little ones? Make sure they're learning to obey. Don't chuckle at disobedience. You don't have to be, all weird and harsh about it. But don't buy the thinking of our world. Oh my word, isn't that kid just like his daddy? And chuckle at disobedience. Start training obedience as soon as you can, and the earlier the better. And you don't have to yell and raise your voice, but train. Say, we expect obedience first and fast and happily. We want you to do it right. And learn to just speak. Learn to say, son, that's what I want you to do. And clarify the expectation. I want you to obey. I'm going to tell you one time I want you to obey. And the Bible teaches, especially when our kids are younger, when they don't, they need to be corrected. And don't let that scare you. It's a generation we live in that's really weird. The Bible teaches that there's 2 ways we correct an error in our children, a blatant error, and one is with reproof. When you can correct a child with your voice, do it. If you can say to your son, hey son, I told you to obey first, and I expect that. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Daddy. And if they do it, then you're good. But a child who is willfully refusing to learn the things that he needs to know to succeed in life, like obedience, the Bible says that you have to use something beyond reproof. The Bible word is a rod. Now that's so tricky for our generation. And the reason being is because we live in a generation that, number 1, has too much misinformation, and number 2, too much abuse and too much silliness when it comes to the family. If you back up to my youth, everybody believed in a rod. I went to a public school, paid for by American tax dollars. We had a Democrat president. His name was Jimmy Carter. You remember those days? Do you know my first grade teacher lined up the entire first grade public school English class, or the entire first grade student body, lined up everybody in the first grade 3 times and paddled every student in the first grade. Her name was Mrs. Buxton. She was 70 years old. I can't prove it, but I think she is an ex-Marine. And I know there's no such thing as an ex-Marine, but I'm telling you, she was tough she's about as tall as your pulpit. She's the shortest, tiniest little lady. But man, she not only spanked the daylights out of the first grade class, she wrote a letter home and bragged about it. And my dad sat me down at home and said, son, you're a young. Youngs don't go to school and get in trouble. So he spanked me again. I said, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? She wrote 2 more letters home to my dad. And they never got home. I may have been in the first grade, but I'm not an idiot, okay? I knew better than to take that letter. I knew what was in that letter. One time, I'm a fast learner. I didn't take those letters home. And one of those came home to catch me because my best buddy Jerry went to the church we attended. We got a paddling one day, and she sent the letter, and I didn't take the letter home. And Sunday afternoon, after we were leaving church, Jerry runs up to the window, because those were days before air conditioning, the windows are rolled down, and Jerry runs up and gives me a high five through the window and said, maybe Mrs. Buxton will have to spank us again this week like she did last week. We are no longer friends. See, obedience means you got to train. You know, the point of a rod is to amplify negative consequences at a time when it's inconsequential. The point of a rod is to amplify negative consequences at a time when it's inconsequential. So if I have to correct the disobedience of a 3-year-old by a rod, by a spanking, or by a swat, not in anger, but in love and gentleness and training, they're 3 years old. They're 5 years old. They're 7 years old. It's a whole lot better to train our child to obey at 3 or 5 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 than for a police officer to have to do it when they're 31. And the Bible point of training obedience is to protect them from the future errors. If my son learns to obey when he's young, when he's got a boss who asks him to do something he doesn't want to do, he'll go ahead and do it out of obedience and keep his job. Nobody laughs when a guy's 35 and disobeys and loses his job and his house because he can't pay it now, and the car gets recalled because he can't get another job making that kind of money. Obedience is a life matter. So train obedience, train in the gospel. How many of you have kids that are not yet saved? Anybody here? If you do, you got to train them. Maybe they're grown. Don't stop training if your son's not saved or your daughter's not saved. Love on them, invest in them, spend time with them, talk to them about the gospel. And if your kids are young, like a lot of the kids around this place, then make sure they know the gospel. Emphasize it, celebrate it, teach it. Teach your kids the Romans road. Teach them John 3:16. And moms and dads, I don't know that I would need to say this here, but I'll say it because sometimes we need to emphasize it. Never, ever undermine the possibility of a child getting saved. Celebrate that. Charles Spurgeon himself said that any child properly taught the gospel can easily be saved by the time they're 5. That was Charles Spurgeon. And I concur with him. You can see your children saved while they're young. Hear that little voice back there? Hear that little voice? Well, he's just 10 months old, Malcolm. He doesn't know anything about the gospel yet. But wouldn't it be an amazing thing if 6 years from now he already knows Jesus and his sins are forgiven and he's growing in the Lord now? And that's entirely possible if you'll train in the gospel. Here's 2 more. Train your children to serve God. This is why we have a rule in our family. You have to sing at church. Because singing is serving God. And you have to bring a Bible. Because I want you to follow along and learn how to use the Bible. And we work on having daily devotions. I say to the kids quite often, have you read your Bible today? And we work on, let's work on soul winning. The other day, we've been so busy lately, I said to the kids the other day, we really need to work on this. We need to set aside some time so we can be aware of the souls around us. We're missing Easter Sunday at our church, and we're kind of disappointed because Easter Sunday at our church is a huge event. We do a Easter program on Friday night, and in the gym next door, we have the Connection Cafe. We have just coffee and drinks over there. We invite all of our guests to go over there, and we really try to sit with them, and every table has tracts and Bibles. And the whole idea is to go over there and have a gospel conversation with your neighbors and your friends and your coworkers. And Sunday's a big gospel day, and we won't get to be there. I want my kids to think about souls. You got to train your kids to serve God. When we hear of a missionary that's given all, we celebrate that because we want our kids to serve God. And if God wants our kids on the other side of the world for the rest of their life, we're going to celebrate it. Because we're raising them to serve God, to have an impact. Train your kids to serve God. Teach them to sing at church and teach them to read their Bible. And if church has soul winning, go soul winning with your children. I loved it when mine were small. Charity was one of my favorite soul winning partners. I'd go to the door holding her. I'd knock on the door and I'd say to her, every door I'd say, smile and wave. Charity, your job is to smile and wave. And I'm telling you, not one person would turn that down. Charity, they'd come to the door. You know, they don't like people knocking on their door. And they know there's somebody from the church here probably. And they'd come to the door and she'd go, I don't care. You may be the devil's third cousin, but you're going to open the door for that. And so go soul winning. Train your kids. And then here's the last thing, and we're done tonight. Train your kids to succeed in life. That's why I say things like, can your daughter cook? Can your son change a tire? Here's at least 3 things that are true about life. Work, respect, right? Purity. You're going to be training your kids about at least those 3 things. You say, well, we don't live on a farm. There's not much work to do. Somebody's got to clean your house. Why not the kids? Somebody's got to mow your yard. How about the kids? Somebody's got to do the dishes. Let the kids. Somebody's got to do the laundry. Train the kids. See, yes, but they don't fold it the way I like it. I'm a perfectionist. You better get over it. At least let them train it, then take it to the bedroom, lock the door, in private, refold it, okay? But train your kids to work. Train your kids to have respect. You know what we never let our kids do? We never let our children say this. Obama. Trump. We don't say that. I know the news reporters refer to our presidents by their last name, Obama this and Trump that. But we decided we wanted our kids to know respect. So that's President Obama. He's the leader of the greatest nation perhaps the world has ever seen. That's President Trump. I don't always agree with everything our presidents have done, but they are leading the greatest nation in the world. So we show respect. We even try to be careful how we refer to people of the law. Sometimes we say cops, and I know it stands for Constable on Patrol. I had to look that up. That's how I know. But it's kind of used as a casual slangish. Cops, there's a cop. So we try to teach our kids to say, no, it's a police officer. Sir, it's a police officer. Respect. I don't know if our kids always do it or not, but one of our rules is when an older person shakes your hand, you stand. Of course, we're training for life to show respect. We still try to take our hats off at a national anthem. It's respect. Here's a hardworking person. Show them respect. Sometimes that's a tricky one because you'll say to a common laborer, thank you, sir. Don't you call me sir, I work for a living. I know that old military term, but I always stop and explain it to them. I'm calling you sir, because you do work for a living, and I respect you for that. Even a man at McDonald's, if he's doing a good job, deserves respect. Is that right? So we show respect and purity. We live in such an adultery-saturated world. TV's full of it. The internet's full of it. Life is filled with it. But I want to train my kids to succeed in life. Pursue purity. You get the idea that parenting is just ridiculously hard work. But in a sense, it's not. It's just that every day of your child's life, you've got to keep pointing them in the right direction. Do it lovingly, gently, graciously. Maybe you're sitting here tonight and you think like this. You know, Dave, my mom and dad didn't train me in anything. I'm glad to tell you that you have a God who is able to help you to overcome the failures of the past. So you can train yourself. If you need to, get at it. You grandparents, don't be discouraged tonight. Get training. You say, well, I don't even have any kids. Well, make sure you're training yourself. Make sure you're serving the Lord and succeeding in life because it's going to be essential in the days ahead. It's late. I need to close. Have I made sense tonight? Are y'all with me? Are we on the same page here? How many of us ought to kneel and say, God, would you help us to train our children? Some of you grandparents ought to kneel. Some of you adults, your kids are grown and they're not saved. Don't give up. Don't give up. Go to work on them. Have them over for a meal. Tell them you want to talk about your will. They'll come and tell them it's your will they get saved. Find a way to win your children to Christ, because your children are important. Have I made sense tonight? You guys have been a gracious audience. Let's have a public invitation tonight. Let's at least ask God to help us, to fill us with His Spirit. Let's pray for each other. There's families in the church, and we all know they're struggling. I mean, I don't, I'm a guest, but you know there's a family that's struggling. This is not meant to criticize each other. This is no place to go, oh my word, wish they had heard that. This is a time to bear one another's burdens and say, goodness, Lord, help us to find a way to help them, encourage them, to be a blessing to them. Let's be for each other. If you can't pray about anything else, get on your knees and pray for a family in your church that's hurting. If you're done raising kids but your grandkids aren't saved, you need to cry out to God for them tonight. Let's have a brief invitation, and Pastor will dismiss us and we'll go home.